Hello, sinners and summoners. My name is Skyne, and welcome to Final Fantasy X. Now, if Final Fantasy IX was a send-off for the classic style of Final Fantasy, full of references to every part of the series and every recurring element, Final Fantasy X, by contrast, was meant to bring it into a new era of gaming. Specifically, it was one of the early flagship titles for the PlayStation 2, and it's indeed one of the earliest games I owned. In fact, the very first game I owned was Rez, which was like a rhythm game shoot-'em-up, but the second game I owned was Fantavision, actually, which was like a kind of arcade fireworks explosion simulator. But the third game, and one of the first games I believe I bought with my own money, birthday money I think, was Final Fantasy X. And the reason why I dedicated myself so hard to bugging my parents for a PlayStation 2 was because I'd played Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9 on the PS1, and I'd never owned a PS1. I'd had to borrow one from a friend, but I'd be able to play those games and got so obsessed with the series that by the time like little bits of press and stuff about Final Fantasy X started leaking out, it was like, you guys gotta have it, for Final Fantasy, yeah! And suffice it to say, Final Fantasy X was a strange experience for me, coming off of 7, 8, and 9, and sort of having become vaguely aware of the SNES titles at that time. And especially the NES title, like the history of the franchise, having become aware of that more broadly. It was strange coming into Final Fantasy X because it is an extremely different game along several different axes. And one of the most notable differences in Final Fantasy X is the aesthetic that it explores, because it's really genuinely the first Final Fantasy game to truly step away from the European Western influence. This is the first Final Fantasy game that is placed deeply and unapologetically in Asian fantasy mythology, Asian aesthetic influences, and indeed in a lot of like sort of pan-Asian cultural references. There's a lot of South Asia in here. There's a lot of Japan and a lot of China. And that, like, genuinely is a very new thing. Like, Final Fantasy has always been a very Western-oriented series in a lot of ways. It started as this, like, stereotypical European fantasy thing, and now it steps into a decidedly different aesthetic, which was strange as a kid who was used to the Western Final Fantasies, but also fascinating. It's also the first game to feature fully voiced voice acting for the series, which means that a lot of my voice acting, if you've gotten used to it over the past couple of games, sorry, it's out the window now. You're going to have to listen to official voice actors do their jobs rather than a happy amateur like me. There's still some text to read through and stuff, but I can rest myself, perhaps, a little bit more. Now, as you may have seen, and as you may see again as the intro sequence cycles, I am playing this with a mod enabled, as usual. This is the Final Fantasy X HD Remaster, but in the style of Square Enix doing HD remasters, they did a better job on this one than they did on either 8 or 9, because they actually had the assets that were necessary to do a proper HD remaster of the thing, but they only remastered it up to like 720p. I think that's probably just like the resolution at which they had the resources, which is like fine, but it doesn't look that great on a modern computer. So I've installed a few mods that, much in the style of the Final Fantasy IX mod that we used, upscales with AI a lot of the textures, a lot of visuals, and adds a few lighting effects here and there. Sort of nothing major. It doesn't transform the look of the game the same way that the Final Fantasy IX mods completely transform Square's crappy HD remaster into a true HD remaster, but it does bring them up to, like, I've downloaded 4K resolution mods just because I could. You're not going to see 4K because we're only recording 1080p, and I've only got 1080p on monitor that I'm using, but the textures are going to be a nicely much higher resolution. I've downloaded some texture mods for a few of the faces that looked a little bit awkward in Square's conversion that have been fixed by the fans. Other than that, no alterations to the original game. So yeah, it's... Final Fantasy X is one of those games that's had a lot of mockery over the years for one particular scene that we'll see probably fairly early on in the playthrough especially, for the voice acting for certain aspects of the way that the game handles its story and animates. And a lot of that is justified to a certain extent. Like, the ha-ha-ha scene is definitely awkward and weird, but we'll talk about it when we get to it. But much like I have softened a lot on Final Fantasy VIII over the years, much like how I've come to appreciate the themes that it was trying to explore a lot more, much like how I've come to appreciate like the way that it was structured around a love story that I wasn't really ready to appreciate when I was a kid playing the game. Final Fantasy X is the same way. I remember it's the first time that I was actually able to appreciate the love story, because that's very much what Final Fantasy X is structured around. It's structured around a love story, much more than Final Fantasy IX was. And I was able to sort of not be quite the same shitty little kid going, romance just for girls, and actually appreciate it. But again, over time, I've come to soften on it a lot more. I've come to appreciate the love story that it tells a lot more and what exactly it means. And like what the love story is trying to do from a narrative perspective. But all of that is for much, much later in our playthrough. This is just a preamble. So let's actually get into it with one of, I will say, one of the best opening CGI cutscenes that Final Fantasy has ever had. Which is not going to happen right away, because first, we have some systems to choose. So, the character advancement system selection. This was a thing that was not in the original Final Fantasy X, as in, the original Japanese release did not have this, but for the international release in Europe, we got the standard sphere grid and the expert sphere grid. What the fuck does any of that mean? Well, you see eventually, but basically, the standard sphere grid... The sphere grid is the method that you have of character progression. Like, how do they get stronger? How do they earn new abilities? That's what the sphere grid does. The standard one is fairly linear. Like, characters earn abilities in sequence in a way that you would expect that sort of vaguely lines up with what you might expect from character classes or jobs in a Final Fantasy context. And the expert sphere grid is a lot more flexible. You can do pretty much whatever the hell you want. You can turn a warrior into a mage into a warrior. And mess around with it a lot more. It's also needlessly complex, and it doesn't add that much to the game unless you're doing like a second playthrough where you want to try out meme builds and stuff like that. So the standard sphere grid is the one that we're gonna go with. As for the soundtrack, there's two options that we've got here. We've got the arranged soundtrack, which came with the HD remaster, which takes most of the same music and adds some like somewhat nicer sounding instruments to a lot of it, makes it sound a little bit more symphonic, a little bit more orchestral. And some people prefer that one, but we are going to go with the original soundtrack, because that's, first of all, because nostalgia, but second of all, also because I disagree with some of the arrangement choices that are made in the arranged soundtracks. Like, there's some instrument bits and some of the tracks that are just like, I don't know why they did that. That was a terrible idea. So original soundtrack it is. And my god, this song. First song I ever learned on the piano, by the way. I learned to play piano specifically to play this.
Listen to my story. This may be our last chance.
So that intro is really fucking good. You don't understand how good it is until you get to a much later point in the game, but it's really genuinely very good. It would have been a lot better if the game didn't insist on spoiling it by playing it over and over again on the menu screen if you just leave it for a little while, but it's good. And so we shift gears 150 billion% completely to whatever the hell this is supposed to be. And I'll tell you again, as a kid seeing this, I was like, wait, no, what? Is this another I don't want another sci-fi, I want fantasy. I want fantasy. Like, I was very much like, as a kid, I loved Final Fantasy VII. Like, it's sort of a diesel punk, cyberpunky dystopian thing. But after Final Fantasy IX, I was so hungry for just fantasy games. So, seeing this opening for the game, where we're clearly in some kind of weird water-based sci-fi world, modern streetwear aesthetic is filtered through panations and everything. Like, that annoyed me strongly, and I was like, no, I wanted fantasy, but don't worry, we'll get fantasy. But the thing I want you to notice about this area right now is, boy howdy, doesn't there seem to be like a lot of water around? And doesn't it seem like our main character lives on a boat? That's interesting. He lives on a ship. That's fascinating. I wonder, and I mean, I can't be sure, but I wonder if maybe water imagery is going to be a feature of this. Like, maybe there's going to be lots of water imagery like you see there in the background with the huge arc of water just kind of shooting across the sky somehow through some kind of sci-fi magic. Who knows? Like, just pay attention to, like, water is like a thing in this game. It's a lot of a thing in this game.
Can I have your autograph?
Of course.
Good luck tonight.
Nothing to worry about. Oh, if I score a goal, I'll, do this. That will mean it was for you, okay? What seat?
Ace block in the front row. Fifth from the right.
Got it.
So, this is one choice that the game kind of shouldn't have made, which is that you still get to name your main character. We're going to go with Tidus, because that's his name. You still get to name your main character, but that's a problem in a game that has voice acting, because now it means you can't record voice lines where anyone ever says the main character's name. Ever. And to their credit, throughout the course of Final Fantasy X, they manage this problem brilliantly. Like, they write the dialogue so carefully that Tidus never has to introduce himself. He never has to say his own name. Nobody ever has to call out his name. There's a few awkward moments, but they manage that really, really well. That being said, that was a dumb thing that they shouldn't have done. It's one of those things of, like, adhering to the traditions of Final Fantasy, where, oh, you're supposed to be able to name your characters. Where it's like, okay, sure, fine, you can name the main character, we'll allow you to do that. But that should have been abandoned by the time they introduced voice acting.
Can you sign this?
No prob.
Please?
Alrighty.
Me too!
Take it easy. Well, gotta go. Cheer for me.
2, 3. Teach us how to blitz!
Hey, I got a game to play.
Then teach us after.
Maybe tonight, well...
You can't tonight.
I mean, tomorrow.
Promise?
Promise.
So the game is already introducing some mysteries to us. Like, for example, who was that weird kid in the background telling Tidus what to do? What the hell is Tidus doing? What's his job? What's this play? Why are they cheering for him? What's this thing with the balls? That's going to get answered soon, but it also takes time to showcase that little bit of animation that the kids do right there. That little pose posture thing. It wants you to pay attention to that because it's going to come up later. There was one other thing. I'll remember that in a second. Oh, right. Animation. That's the thing I wanted to talk about. Now, we're not going to do animation breakdowns like I do on my main channel here, although I'm tempted to, because this is, again, one of those things bringing the game into the new era. This is one of the first Final Fantasy games that has real character animation as over the course of normal gameplay and not just in CGI pre-rendered cutscenes. We saw that a little bit in the ending of Final Fantasy IX, like with the scene where we have the CGI cutscene that Sedan's normal character model is like running through, and where they actually do quite a lot of character animation on him specifically. But this game makes character acting and character animation a much more prominent part of the game. And one of the ways that it does that is with clever bits of model switching. So, Tidus and Yuna and like all of the characters that we're going to be meeting have two character models, probably more than two, but they have at least two character models. One of them is a low-detail, general-purpose model that you use for running around the overworld, doing most of the stuff that you do, and the other one is a much, much higher quality, much more articulated character model that is used for close-ups and cutscenes, like the one we just saw of Tidus looking at whoever the hell that guy was on the light poster on the side of the building. Where you'll notice that, like, he's got eyeball movement, he can, like, articulate his lips, he can make expressions, and this was, for the time, genuinely quite impressive. Like, this was a very impressive amount of character animation, especially the character animation that managed to stay within the anime aesthetic of animation generally, while doing a really surprisingly good job of not feeling like a cartoon, of having a little bit of that hot breath of life to it that Final Fantasy later would get famous for, like having these hyper-realistic stylized characters, but this is where that began. This is the first time that they really incorporated character acting and animation, not just with a series of stock animations that like play when like we have frustrated pose where they do and we have like excited pose, or we have like shaking their head pose, but like actual custom-made character acting for the cutscenes. Which, again, as an animation nerd, that's a big deal to me, but it's the kind of thing that I feel like a lot of people didn't give the game that much credit for at the time, like just the sheer amount of animation work that went into its dialogue and cutscenes, as we shall talk about extensively over the course of the game. For now, let's listen to the radio.
I was in a coffee shop running away from home when I heard the news. Our hero, checked, gone, vanished into thin air. My dad must have been his biggest fan. I knew how sad he'd be. Heck, we all were that day. Zanar, I says to myself, what are you thinking? I went running straight back home. We sat up talking about Jack all night. My dad and I never talked so much. Whoa, didn't mean to reminisce, folks. Anyway, 10 years later, the Jack Memorial Cup tournament is today. The two teams that have won through to the finals are, of course, the Abes from A East and the Duggles from C South. I know there's a lot of people out there today to see the star of the Abes. In just 1 year, he's become the team's #1 player. He's Jack's blood and the new hope of Blitzball. What kind of super play will he show us today? Will we see his father's legendary shot? I don't think I'm the only one excited here, folks.
So, there we see the little sleight of hand that the game pulls in order to avoid saying Tidus' name. We're excited to see the star of the Abes. In just 1 year, he's become the team's #1 player. Never says his name, but just gives us enough context information that we can infer that is this guy right here. Which, again, props to the writers for managing that, even though it's silly. So, here's where we get the unvoiced dialogue. That's gonna be a killer game tonight, I know it! Tonight's game's gonna be one for the history books. You better hurry, the game can't start without you. Hurry up, the game's about to start. Man, tickets for tonight's game cost an arm and a leg. Let's see. There, she wants tickets to the game. If you tell her, yes, I'll definitely get you some tickets for sure, for real, then you get a couple of potions. Just being mean. I don't feel so good. Like I'm on a roller coaster going down. All the Santa kids watching now. Put on a show for him. I'm sure you'll be the star player this year. Anyway, not a lot of NPCs have consequential dialogue at this point. But did you notice the little shimmer on the road as we were running past there? The little watery shimmer as though the whole surface is covered in water?
Make way, make way!
Isn't that interesting?
Coming through, sorry. Hey, I'm gonna be late. Hey, let go of me.
Anyway, now it's time for the best intro cutscene. I'm gonna make it a little loud. I don't care what anyone says, that fucking rules. And again, water, 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 water imagery absolutely everywhere. Anime Jeff Goldblum.
What are you doing here?
I was waiting for you.
What are you talking about?
Notice how the screen is shimmering as though we're underwater all of a sudden. I'll point it out every time it happens because there's so much. It's
It
everywhere.
begins.
What?
Don't cry.
There's the high-quality model.
What the?
The one that can articulate its eyes and mouth.
Hey, wait!
And now we're back to the low-quality model. The game model switches all the time. It's fun to keep a lookout for it. To notice when we go from one to the other.
Hey, not this way.
Look. We called it sin.
Sin?
Take it.
Auron rules.
A gift from Jack.
My old man?
I hope you know how to use it.
Welcome to the combat system. So, a little bit of production history. In the very...
don't matter. We cut through.
Sure, Auron. In the very early days of Final Fantasy X, the ambition for the game was that there would be no random encounters on the map. Like, that there wouldn't be, like, a transition screen into a battle scene, and then you fight the monsters. The idea, the hope was, again, this whole thing about bringing it into the next generation, was that they could create a game where the monsters are on the field all the time, and then you just run into them, and then you start the battle seamlessly without having the battle screen transition. Ultimately, that didn't work, but you can see the remnants of the idea of it, like some of the scenes that were created with this in mind, including this one. This was one of the scenes that was supposed to transition completely seamlessly from overworld gameplay to battle gameplay, and yet they had to have that little because they have to switch out some models. They have to, like, there's some stuff that has to change in the scene in order to support what the combat scene needs. It's one of those technical limitations that they couldn't get around back then, but eventually managed to get around with Final Fantasy XII, which we'll get to after this one, because we're not playing 11, because I can't. Anyway, hello, the combat system. As you may have noticed, I've been standing still for a while, and absolutely nothing has happened. Now, in Final Fantasy so far, in most of the in certainly the games that we have played, if you stand still for a whole long time and you don't do anything, enemies will eventually attack you. That's not how it works in this game. In this game, we have a turn system where we can see over on the right there, this little list that's scrolling right now, exactly the turn of who is going to act, when they're going to act, and like exactly who happens to take an action when. And that turn action changes dynamically depending on the action that I choose for the characters. So some actions take longer than others. Right now, that's not going to matter because attack and item are pretty much the same thing. But later on in the game, certain spells, certain abilities that you use will cause more of a delay on your character in the turn order. And that's part of the combat system. Interestingly, this is kind of a throwback where Final Fantasy IV, like starting with Final Fantasy IV, they invented the active time battle system, the ATB system, which was like the little scrolling bars that fill up, and then when the bar is full, your character can act, and then you can use haste and slow to speed up and slow down your turn order and stuff like that. That was an invention they made for Final Fantasy IV to make the battles more dynamic. Rather than being turn-based and kind of static as they had been in Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 3, they wanted them to be more dynamic, like feel more real-time than they otherwise had before. And then it's interesting to me, like for me, that's just a little funny thing that for the next generation Final Fantasy game, like the one that's supposed to bring it into a new era, the combat system is decidedly a throwback. I love the combat system, by the way. I adore it. I really, really like it, and we'll explore it extensively as we go through the game. And here again, you can see the idea of like seamless transition to a battle.
Don't bother
bother going after all of them. Cut the ones that matter and run.
Where, yeah, like, they chain these battle encounters together in, like, a long sequence. We're gonna see less and less of that as the game goes on, because, like, those ideas were early in development. And aren't really... They're not gonna stick around, unfortunately. But yeah, Final Fantasy X takes this in medias res kind of... it wants you to be confused right now. Like, it doesn't explain where we are, what the hell is going on, what was that underwater football game that those dudes were playing. It doesn't tell you anything, or explain a damn sight of anything that's happening or going on.
Get out of my town!
Some can't wait to die.
Okay, here comes the overdrive system. Anyway, I'll explain that in a second. It doesn't explain anything to you. You're not supposed to understand what's going on here. It's supposed to be confusing. Because Final Fantasy X kind of does... It does something that Final Fantasy VIII attempted to do. If you remember in that game, you have this whole conceit in the game that the characters have lost a lot of their memory. And so part of the reason why they don't understand the world very well and they constantly have to have things explained to them is because, well, the conceit is that they... Because of their use of the Guardian Force powers, they don't understand a lot of the world. They don't understand themselves, and over the course of the game, as you, the player, understand the world better by exploring it and by seeing the story play out, the characters begin to understand themselves better too, and you manage to restore their memories and sort of reverse the harmful effects of the game. That's the thing. That never really worked for me. As you may remember, I talked about that extensively in my Final Fantasy VIII playthrough. In Final Fantasy X, they do a different thing. They keep you confused early on by setting your perspective to a point of view character, this being Tidus, who has good reason to be confused, but only him. Like, they choose one point of view character who's out of the loop, who doesn't understand what's going on, and everyone else has a better grasp of things as they happen. And then they invent a basic Isekai-style reason for why do people need to explain things to this character all the time, so that the player can be brought in as well, which works. Like, it's more of a trope, but for me it works a lot better. We'll talk about that more as we go on. Anyway, these are limit breaks. There we go. And they work in the classical style that you would expect. There's a meter underneath your character's health bar. It fills up as you take damage. And when the damage meter fills up completely, that's when you can use an overdrive, which is basically a limit break that does a bunch more damage than that. Hey, it's nice. For Auron, you saw me use that ability where I had to do a bunch of button inputs, and if I do that correctly, I get a lot more damage, and if I don't do it correctly, then obviously the opposite thing happens. For Tidus, it works a little bit differently. Nope. There. You have to hit the center marker there, and that gets harder and harder as his limit breaks get stronger. So, this particular battle has a gimmick to it, though. You can't actually lose. It is literally impossible to lose this battle, because the very first thing you do as you enter is you use Auron's limit break to kill all the little enemies. And the big enemy, like the big thing sticking out of the ground there, Sin-Spawn Ams, or Amis, or whatever, only has gravity-based attacks, which is to say it can only reduce your health by a percentage, but it can't actually reduce your health to 0. So it's a clever little trick of programming, but it is, in fact, physically impossible to lose this fight at all. Which also means that you can cheese this a little bit, which I used to do when I was a kid, because right now, the way overdrives work is that I only gain overdrive bar when my characters take damage, but over the course of the game, you earn different ways of building up overdrive. So there's one where you build up overdrive bar by attacking enemies, and there's one where you build up overdrive bar by just waiting and having your allies take turns, and there's all kinds of different ones. And because you can't lose in this fight, you can actually use it to grind out a bunch of those overdrive modes for Tidus and Auron early on if you want to. We're not going to do that because it takes forever, and there's no point doing it. It's not a substantial gameplay advantage going forward. It's just one of those things that, as a kid, completely obsessed with this game, I used to do. I used to spend like 6 or 7 hours doing like these little early grinds that I found, like these little early exploits, in order to make my characters as powerful as possible, like really early on in the game, and then just breeze through the rest of the game with absolutely no challenge whatsoever. And I'd spend a lot more time playing the early part of the game, and then the entire rest of the game I'd just like sail through without ever stopping to do a damn thing. So, you know, there's that. There's a couple of more exploitable moments in this game that I'm going to tell you about as we get to them. But for the moment, let's just move on. Can you tell I have a lot of affection for this game? Final Fantasy IX is the best one. It's my favorite. I love it the most, but I have spent more time playing Final Fantasy X by far than I have played Final Fantasy IX. That's a save point. It heals you and does stuff.
What are you laughing at, old man? Lauren, let's get out of here.
We're expecting.
Huh? Give me a break, man.
I'm sure that's fine. Again, here you actually have infinite enemies that you can fight, which is something that I think some people can exploit, but we're not going to bother. We're just going to move things along. As you can see, I take out one enemy and another one instantly takes its place. Nope. No wings start to flicker, my friend. Absolutely not. Verboten. It means it's charging up for a more powerful attack, which is annoying.
This could be bad. That! Knock it down.
What?
Trust me, you'll see.
And here's another one of the things that they're introducing in this game. Something that, again, it's going to show up a little bit less and less as the game goes on. One of those early ideas that they toyed with, again, because having the seamless combat system, they toyed with including environment object in the combat scenes. And I believe one of the early ideas was that like there were supposed to be like barrels and stuff around that your characters could attack in order to deal damage to enemies and stuff like that. That got largely abandoned, but there's a bunch of fights still in the game that have gimmicks like this one, where you're not really supposed to attack the enemies. You're supposed to smack that thing around for whatever good it'll do, yeah. And win battles by doing little environmental puzzles, basically, using the combat system, like what's about to happen now.
Sure. This is it. This is your story.
when the mushrooms kick in.
Hey. Hey!
My old man?
Again, swimming in air, seemingly.
I thought about a lot of things. Like where I was, what I got myself into. I started to feel lightheaded, and then sleepy. I think I had a dream of being alone. I wanted someone, anyone beside me, so I didn't have to feel alone anymore. Anybody there? Aaron! Hey!
By the way, the song, the heavy metal song that played in the intro cutscene, it's called Otherworld. It's literally called Isekai. just saying, that's very much one of the things that this game is doing, is it's messing with the tropes of portal fiction, or as you would know it in anime, Isekai. Well, isn't that interesting? Something's written here. Edra mutfrana puntk of mekrade imishida dra plumegalt hekrad. Feder makalania pareth dra winder bemin ui sekr. Mulghud udra mavt pit udra nekrad.
What do we have here? Nope, can't read it.
What on earth was that? Well, I'll explain later. Let's see, there's at least one treasure chest here somewhere, and I believe it's something over here-ish. Not that we need it that much, but I want to get it, just because I always get it. And I'm a creature of habit. Ah, right, that's the Bhed primer. So, let's just grab this so that we have a little bit of it. There. So, what is all of this? Well, it is the Bhed language, and throughout the world of the game, you will find little books lying around, and each book will teach you one letter. Because what the Bhed language in this game is, it's not really a language, it's what's called a cipher. It's a replacement cipher, specifically, that, at least in the English translation, replaces one letter with another letter. In a series, like, I think they replaced, like, pretty consistently vowels with vowels and consonants with consonants, which helps keep the words moderately pronounceable. But it is just a cipher. And that was the thing that was written on that weird mirror thing on the wall that we couldn't otherwise read. That was that language. And because those primers are really actually kind of hard to find, and because there's a lot of bits of the early game where you listen to Bhed language but you don't understand what's being said, you can import the primers that you found in a previous save into any new game that you're playing, so that if you find all the Bhed primers in one playthrough, you can import them into all your other games, and then you can see what the characters are saying over the course of the thing. But get to that later. Here's another new thing, by the way. This game, as you may have noticed, has fully 3D environments, which is rather new for Final Fantasy. If you remember, Final Fantasy IX had entirely pre-rendered backgrounds with absolutely no real 3D environments outside of a few objects placed in the scene. This game has a mix of pre-rendered backgrounds and fully 3D environments. This environment right here is fully 3D. Some others, I may point them out as we get there, have pre-rendered backgrounds on them, mixed and matched between them. And again, you can see the idea here was to have the battle transition be seamless, but they still had to do the little fadey screen effect thing to make it work. Say hello to the battle theme for this game, by the way. You'll be hearing it a lot. But not right now. Say hello to the boss theme for this game. You'll be hearing it a bunch, but a little bit less. So again, I can't actually lose this fight. This boss right now can only do half of my health with each of its attacks. And so it does. But it's all scripted, so what's going to be happening next is we're going to be getting the hell out of there. Nearly got vored there.
I had made it out of the frying pan and into the freezer. I thought I was gonna die in this place.
And because there's fully 3D environments,
Need fire.
we can do that We can have the camera swing around. We can have the camera show the scene from different angles. We can have the perspective change as the character moves around. Now, the majority of the Final Fantasy X experience remains this. Like a fixed camera following the character around. We don't get to have camera control in this game. But it's a new thing to have this ability from the developers to be able to, like, focus in on the statue there, for example. So, need some flint. Thank you. Right, that's where it came from. Doi. Can't open that one yet. You'll also notice that we have a mini-map, which is a first for the game. Ether! There you are. Give me that potion. Thank you very much.
I need food. What do you want?
It was a bad call. Your team lost because of you.
You came to say that?
It's been 10 years. I thought you'd be crying.
Who, me?
You cried.
Hey, wait! Don't go out on me! Nah, just hold on. I'll get more wood. Give me a break!
Just can't catch a break, can you, Titus? Anyway, more boss theme. And more scripted battles. Well, mostly. I think you can actually get knocked out in this one if you're not careful. And again, this ambition of seamlessness, of like things happening in the combat space rather than the combat space being separate from the real world, as it often is in Final Fantasy games, or had been in Final Fantasy games, where like you run around, random encounter, you get teleported to a completely different place, you have a fight, and then you get teleported back to the overworld map. The ambition here is to have the combat be much more a part of everything, all at the same time.
Cool.
Boom. I think I can steal one more set of grenades. Yeah. I'll need them a little later.
Phew. That was close. Hey, let me go!
Fredek Drak! Ifin, Irisa, Tekiaka! Wag, Edeku! Gemed?
Fed! Srivadak Risa!
Dralmia, Drakisha Dave.
Ifun Petted! Fapuneket Fedrik! Kuno.
And that is the Bhed language. You noticed some of the letters in the subtitles were pink. Those are the letters that I have learned, which allows us to see what those letters are supposed to be if you decode the cipher of the language. I don't have that many yet, so it doesn't help us that much. But it's there. It's a mechanic that incentivizes you to replay the game so that you can see all the dialogue that the characters are saying in the early parts of the game. It's nothing groundbreaking or anything, but it's just fun to find out what it was, this like nonsense language that you heard what the heck any of it meant.
Kid, it's Daija.
Hey, that hurts!
Musujek, Rain?
Whoa. Okay.
Canis!
Right, whatever.
Tui Hood Kabeg?
I said I don't understand.
Akomala!
Fed! He said you can stay if you make yourself useful.
You understand me? All right, I'll work.
Again, notice the custom animation as the weird sunglasses guy with the mohawk does that. He had a custom set of animations, like miming the whole swim around and do things that he wants our character to do. Which, again, not a big deal in modern game development at all, but for the early 2000s on the PS2, kind of a big step for the series. Anyway, this is going to be where we cut the first episode of Final Fantasy X. Are you confused? Good, because you're supposed to be. Nothing is supposed to make even a little bit of sense just yet. But if you enjoyed having things not make even a little bit of sense to you, and also a little bit of heavy metal, sci-fi, water sport. Ooh, I should not phrase it like that. Sports in water. Then like, comment, and or subscribe to the video because of the algorithm thing. Number go up. Good, because YouTube. You know, we ask you to do it at the end of every video because we have to, because it really does help to have the numbers go up. So there's that. If you want to support the channel more directly than that, Patreon is available for that purpose. I also have a tip jar and a merchandise store. You can use them if you want to, and memberships are available on this channel for $1 a month if you have a little bit of pocket change that you want to get rid of. If you don't want to do any of that, please don't worry about it. It's completely fine. Thank you very much for watching. Please remember to wear a mask and do wash your hands.